But what I'm going to talk about now is Homo erectus, meaning upright man. And of course, this is the first stage where our human ancestors have the prefix homo. So you could say that this is the first human, really. So they do represent probably one of the most significant portions in human evolution, in my view, in that lots of things that all of a sudden became very unique to human beings occurred within this era when they were the dominant hominid species. They're also, I believe, proposed to be one of the last common ancestors with Denisovans and Neanderthals, although some people contest, and I think it's quite convincing, that it's actually much later hominids and we're actually more closely related than some people might argue. But that's at least just my perspective. So the oldest fossil of Homo erectus is dated at 1.9 million years ago and was found in Kenya. Some have suggested that they're the first hominid to leave Africa as well, around 1.8 million years ago. Remember, of course, those older one-style tools from Dmanisi in Georgia? Well, this was around the time when they came onto the scene 1.8 million years ago. Of course, that's about 100,000 years later from the first fossil evidence we found in Kenya. So 100,000 years later, they're probably in Georgia, in the Caucasus. So that's sort of Europe. Of course, it's not very difficult, well, from the grand scheme of things, it's not very difficult to get outside of Africa through sort of Middle East.
And go through the Levant.
Yeah, exactly.
Right, yeah.
Which we know there certainly were early humans there as well. But so it's quite compelling that these are the first hominids to have left Africa.
Right.
So,
well, there's also the idea of the multi-regional hypothesis.
Of course, yeah.
So it might not even be even as simple as that. It might the true picture, the real truth, might be even more.
Yeah, I've
nuanced
got an entire episode dedicated to that, so it'll be fine.
All right.
So they existed to at least 250,000 years ago, from about this 1.9 million year ago upper bound to that. That's surprisingly recent, really, isn't it? In the grand scheme of things. One thing worthy of note is that 14 skull caps, so like the top of their head, and a tibia were found along the Solo River in Java, which is Indonesia, which were dated between 117,000 years ago to 108,000 years ago, which is really recent, really, for something that came onto the scene nearly 2 million years ago. That's quite modern. It's obviously pre-Ice Age. It was a different world. They had megafauna, all of that sort of thing. But it was around for a very long time, is the point I want to make. And surprisingly recently in human history, that means that they would have existed alongside anatomically modern humans for certain. Anatomically modern humans did exist then. So, whether they rub shoulders with them is another thing.
Well,
but
we would have interbred with them, surely.
Well, we don't know whether human expansion to Java was going on there, or whether it was very, very limited. And also, if it's one of our ancestors, would we be able to tell in the genetic material? Because we've inherited that genetics already. So if we're just getting...
I see what you mean. Right.
How do you untangle it? But I've not necessarily looked at the interbreeding with Homo erectus because it mostly goes on in much later hominids, which we definitely coexisted with.
Right. It seems to me, from what I know or am aware of, that it seems to be whenever there was two different species shared the world at the same time, and it was biologically possible to have offspring, it happened.
Yeah.
So, again, the picture of interbreeding between archaic hominids and more modern versions, even sapiens, it just seems if it was possible, it happened. So, right, okay, well, we'll have to leave it at that, I think. But,
so, yes, it's particularly interesting that this species existed alongside Australopithecus as well. There's an overlap between them and Homo habilis, if you believe that they're their own species, and modern humans, obviously Neanderthals, Denisovans as well. So they kind of as a species, existed along a decent portion of human evolution. So I find that fascinating.
It is.
So the location of origin is uncertain, but it seems to be East Africa again, just based on where most of the fossil evidence is. Although there are certainly scattered populations in Europe, Africa, and Asia, which is quite significant, of course.
I think it's worth bearing in mind that the time frames we're looking at here are thousands and thousands of years, tens of thousands of years, maybe sometimes hundreds of thousands of years. So given hundreds of thousands of years, let's say, it's not crazy to think they would sort of, and the populations are tiny compared to our modern world, but there's no reason why they wouldn't have dispersed over all the landmass, really.
Well, we have evidence that there are actually other hominid sort of expeditions, if you will, into Europe and Asia that were likely to be unsuccessful. They sort of paved the way, died out, and then eventually a hominid came along that could actually do it well and successfully.
Right.
So in terms of appearance, let's have a look at a picture. Here we have what looks like Joe Rogan on the right-hand side.
Or Valuev.
And Valuev on the left-hand side. I was actually going to say that as well.
Big Nog and Little Nog. Nog brothers.
These reconstructions, although it's not entirely clear, I wasn't able to find out which time in Homo erectus's existence. I'd imagine this would probably be later. And also, of course, there's debate about whether they lost their body hair. Probably not to that extent whereby they're completely smooth all over, but I imagine that's just by merit of it's difficult to reconstruct something that is all weird and hairy.
Right, fair enough.
But in terms of facial structure, it does start to look a bit modern. I mean, the guy on the left, you might see at a football match somewhere,
Right.
eating a pie, drinking a pint. The guy on the right, you might see in Texas doing podcasts. But it's
very unfair. But, sorry, go on.
I think it's just the reconstruction's a bit unflattering. I'm not being rude to Joe Rogan. I like his work very much. But yes, you can say that, it's noticeably not quite human, but it's close enough, isn't it? Whereby you don't look at that and think, oh, what kind of creature is that?
Yeah, right.
You can tell. So Homo erectus had a more modern gait and body proportions, but were a bit stockier than modern humans. So quite broad-chested. They were obviously larger bodied than the Australopithecus before. They had more flat faces like us, but still had quite large noses, as you can see, and heavier set brows, particularly that one on the left, I think is a good example of that. They had smaller teeth and jaws, which indicated they had a change in diet.
Right. This comes in about the same time, right? 1.5, 2 odd million years ago, started cooking food, right? Is that right?
Not quite that early.
Okay.
But it's certainly the time whereby we started using things to hunt, which I'll get onto in a second. Okay. But there's a change in diet. Obviously, beforehand, they ate mostly plants, fruits, that sort of thing. So maybe there was a much larger meat intake here at this point in our evolution. They also potentially had less thick body hair, but this is, again, something that's debated and not quite certain yet. One thing that's very significant is there wasn't very much sexual dimorphism, meaning that men and women were more similar in size and build and shape than they were both previously and probably today as well. So what this tells us is that within apes more generally, little sexual dimorphism tends to be indicative of them being more monogamous, and large amounts of sexual dimorphism tend to be typical of societies that live with a single dominant male who has a harem of females. So if we move on to this next picture, if we look at mandrills, there's a male mandrill with a female one. They have that sort of harem structure with a dominant male who rules the roost, and you can kind of see the difference in size, and just the skull is massive.
It's like almost a different thing, isn't it?
Yeah.
The first thing that popped into my mind when you said that was lions. Sorry, carry on.
But yeah, lions is a good example where obviously that's not a primate, but it's still operating under the same sort of thing. It is a law of nature, which is more true of primates than perhaps other mammals, though.
That is a striking example, actually, isn't it? Mandrill.
That's why I picked it out. It was the one that came to mind. And then you can get things like owl monkeys, which I don't have a picture of, but they basically look the same, and they're pretty much hyper-monogamous.
Right.
So it's a very indicative thing. It's also quite depressing because obviously there are noticeable differences in human beings, and we at Lotus Eaters are big fans of monogamy, and it's a bit of a shame that biologically speaking we aren't programmed really to be 100% monogamous, but doesn't give you an excuse to go out and misbehave.
Our alphas are too alpha for their own good.
That's one way of looking at it.
I don't know. Anyway.
So in terms of Homo erectus's intelligence, they were small-brained to begin with, this sort of Demonisi era when they're using the older one style tools. They had brain capacity of about 540 cubic centimetres, which is, again, the upper bound of the Australopiths, wasn't it? That was about 550. So it's sort of chimp-level intelligence, perhaps a little bit more, slightly larger than a chimpanzee.
It must have been more, though, right?
Mm-hmm. Yes, it is.
Right.
But they existed for 1.5 million years. So over that time span, over living in 3 different continents, there's such a large amount of variation that, for example, we have record that 1.2 million years ago in Indonesia, their brain size was 1,200 cubic centimetres, which is, over doubled in 500,000 years, which is massive, which is also indicative of lots of things which I'll get onto. So modern humans have an average of about 1,350 cubic centimetres. So that's only 150 more in modern humans than 1.2 million years ago. Right. So there's something significant going on there, isn't there? So it's also important that genes for higher brain connectivity, SRGAP2C and SRGAP2D, evolved at a similar time to Homo erectus. And this is, again, this brain connectivity that I was talking about. So having all these neural connections to have more complex thoughts. We can trace that genetically to that period in time of this,
Okay, great, because that was something I was going to ask you about. Because again, just to make the point, that necessarily the actual volume of your brain or even the weight of it isn't the whole story, right? So you could have a Homo erectus whose brain is almost the size of a modern human brain, or pretty much is. It's basically almost the same. And yet that brain's actual ability, or the number of connections and neurons or whatever, it's just nowhere near. So again, they're sort of their physiology, their actual skull, very similar. The size of the brain is almost the same, and on and on and on. And yet they're not capable of mastering fire, let's say. For example. So the actual cognitive ability, let's say that, is still a long way off what you or I would be capable of, for example.
Absolutely.
Is all that fair to say?
Absolutely.
Right, okay.
So it's worth mentioning that these sorts of connectivity progressions and this massive increase in brain size seems to represent, some people believe, the building blocks of our modern language ability as well.
Okay.
They hypothesized that they could have had a form of proto-language or a form of sign language or some means of communicating with one another, because they would have likely had the brain capacity. It's all speculative, of course, but it seems like they probably had some degree of capacity for communication, more so certainly than, say, modern primates do.
And doesn't it also, the thing we've said a couple of times here, the idea of you become through evolution, you become, over a long period of time, you become cleverer. And then the ability to create or have any sort of proto-culture or teaching, passing things down through generations, and that those things feed off of each other, and it's a self-perpetuating type deal going on there. And so we can only really infer, right, that correct me if I'm wrong, that Homo erectus, for example, must have had a much more sophisticated, whatever it was, much more sophisticated ability to communicate amongst themselves than, say, today you get chimpanzees howl at each other and make noises that the other ones recognise, don't they? Like they'll make a certain hoot means there's danger or something, all sorts of things. Lots of animals, not even higher apes, but all sorts of animals do that, don't they?
Absolutely, yeah.
Even birds, that have got tiny brains really, can make certain noises that communicate to the rest of their community.
I don't doubt that they had that level of ability. It's probably something more sophisticated again.
That's what I'm saying. It must have been quite sophisticated, or probably not language as we're using it right now. Probably not that, but maybe. But whatever it was would have to have been way more sophisticated, way more sophisticated than just hoots and sounds. It must have. It's not like necessarily had verbs and nouns and everything, but a quite we don't know. It's all speculation, isn't it? But some ability to communicate relatively sophisticated ideas, and throwing it into the future as well. Again, this idea of cause and effect, understanding or having a real appreciation for cause and effect, a type of imagination going into the future. If we do these number of steps, it should lead to this thing that we've never done before, never seen before. It only exists in our imaginations. And there's multiple steps before you can get there. The ability to communicate that. They must have had that, no? They must have.
Yeah, well, it seems apparent. I mean, if I talk about a bit about their tool use and their behaviour, then it should hopefully become entirely clear, because we do have a decent amount of archaeological evidence for their tool use. So, of course, they're one of the first Homo species to use advanced Acheulean-style tools. These are the sort of hand axes as we know them, the ones that are deliberately designed, as you're saying. Although at the beginning, it's likely that they did use these older one-style tools. So we have the example of Dmanisi 1.8 million years ago, whereby they had these choppers and not much else. And they were still hunting meat mostly, because they found butchered carcasses of animals where they'd clearly eaten them, probably raw because they hadn't invented cooking yet. But some of they are most associated with these hand axes, the species. They did carry on to be used beyond their existence, but they are the ones that are most idiosyncratic with these hand axe tools.
Can I just say ever so quickly about, again, even like 1 million or 2 million years ago, smashing open bones to get the bone marrow. Apparently that was important.
Absolutely, yeah. They found cracked open bones with bone marrow.
Because bone marrow, although probably to your eyes actually disgusting to eat cold, raw bone marrow, but it would have been something like a delicacy to them. And the ability to have a vastly increased protein intake compared to simply vegetarian type creatures. That again, it helps with that loop of just having generations where the brain's slightly bigger, slightly more sophisticated, on and on and on. The ability to smash open bones and eat the bone marrow, I understand, is quite a key aspect in that.
Yeah, well, it's very nutritious, and making the most of that would surely have helped them survive. So,
but obviously, if it's bone marrow in creatures that you've hunted, then you're also obviously hunting for their flesh as well.
Absolutely.
Okay, sorry.
So it has been speculated that they were the first hominins to master fire, although this wouldn't have been early on in their evolution. It would have been much later.
When do you think sort of the earliest fire and cooking would have been then? 1 million years ago?
I'm going to get onto that just in a second.
Oh, all right. Sorry.
But yeah, obviously it takes a lot of time and energy to digest cooked or uncooked food. So you also need a quite sturdy jaw, which is quite strong. And by this point in human history, this had decreased because they weren't eating these plants and things, and they had much smaller jaws, more comparable to our own. The earliest evidence for controlled fire, as in deliberate fire, comes from Israel, and it's 780,000 years ago.
Oh, okay. I thought it was a little older than that, but okay, that's interesting, isn't it? Because that's still a long time ago
of it. It doesn't mean it wasn't happening.
Oh, great. Okay.
So that's the only evidence that we found, but it could be up to 1 million years ago.
But then surely at that point, the creatures the Homo erectus is, I suppose, that we're doing that. Again, I think you can say, right, would you agree, that that's another leap forward in the sense of it's not just even napping a hand axe with 5 or 6 chips on each side. No, now you've got multiple tools that do different things, that have different functions, and you use them in sequence with each other to create, well, in this example, fire, which simply wouldn't be there at all if you hadn't done these very specific sets of things in the right order, and on and on and on. It seems like an animal that was able to conjure fire would be very similar, or correct me if I'm wrong, would be very similar in cognitive ability to us. Am I going too far?
Not necessarily,
Okay.
I would say so.
All right, okay.
Because fire could have been used opportunistically before, when it occurred naturally before this. And
Okay, so I don't mean that though. I mean when they've actually made tools to conjure fire for themselves.
I would say that it's almost certain that they weren't like us by that point. That it comes
closer to.
Yes, definitely.
All right, okay.
But yes, I think it is likely that it occurred naturally in that they realised, okay, we've got this cooked meat that's been of an animal caught in a fire that occurred naturally. It tastes really good.
Right, yeah.
I really like that. Whenever there's a fire, I'm gonna see if I can take advantage of that. And then maybe from that point onwards, the sort of idea was seeded in their mind that, okay, well, now we can actually deliberately try and make it. But yes, there is a site in Kubifora in Kenya, which is 1.5 million years old, that shows signs of fire, but it's not clear if it was made deliberately and used.
Maybe that's what I'm thinking.
But it's one of those sites where we found lots of hominin remains, so it could just be naturally occurring and coincidental, but it could be deliberate. But you can't possibly tell in this case.
Okay. But by 700,000 years ago, though,
almost certain, yeah.
Right, okay.
That's definitely a controlled fire. So it's pretty much 800,000, we could probably safely assume.
Okay.
So it is also likely that they used wooden spears, but there's not been any of that preserved because, of course, it's made of wood, so it's not going to preserve easily. We do have preserved Neanderthal ones, which I'll talk about probably next time because we don't have the time. We're about to run out of time. But it is even speculated that they found a stone-barbed blade that looks a bit like it's got like a little barb point and another barb below it, and it's stone, and it looks like the head of a spearfishing thing, which is entirely possible. But they found one of those, and they're not entirely sure who and when to attribute it to, but it's speculated that it could be Homo erectus, which is entirely possible. So in terms of their behaviour, I'm going to have to go over this very quickly to finish up, and we'll pick up where we left off next time.
Okay.
But we think that they were the first hominin that had the ability to run. Some mathematical estimates suggest that they could have run for up to 5 hours without stopping. This raises the question of hairlessness, because, of course, long-distance running is not helped by a thick coat of hair, and therefore we think that they became hairless about 1.2 million years ago when the gene for darker skin evolved, because, of course, without the protective hair, then you need more sun protection. So around 1.2 million years ago, I think, is the time where we became hairless and probably chased down our prey until it collapsed of heat exhaustion.
Right. But we were able to sweat.
So we were fine.
Right.
Yes. Which also ties in nicely with that 5 hours of running time, because by that point, any animal would be exhausted and we could easily kill and butcher it with pretty simple tools. We're not going to need to necessarily coordinate hunting strategies. So it also seems like the first species of Homo to be an apex predator, which also might explain why we had this cognitive explosion in that the brain size evolved significantly, because they probably had much wider access to food, which then gives them the energy to then develop this. It's sort of a precondition for them for intelligence to increase. There are bones of large mammals, such as hippos, that have marks that indicate they had access to the best cuts of meat. And if they could hunt things like hippos as hominids, it's safe to say at that point they were probably apex predators like we are today. Also, of course, shows that they were capable of hunting large game, which, again, seems to suggest some sort of coordination between them. It's also speculated that they were the first to adopt a division of labour between foraging and hunting, although we don't have enough evidence to say conclusively about that. And one final thing to end on, which is quite significant, is we may have our first instance of art, because there was a shell with patterns scratched onto it found on Java, which was found to come from about 500,000 years ago, which may be later Homo erectus. So, yes, within this time period, even 500,000 years ago, we may well have had primitive forms of art.
To watch the full video, please become a premium member at lotuseaters.com.